All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar. This is the third session we are hosting in our food waste webinar series, which is also a part of FFAR's 10-year anniversary. And this year, we're celebrating all the impactful work that FFAR has accomplished in the last decade. And today we are privileged to have one of our grantees, Dr. Weidmann from Cornell University with us, who will be talking about his project on modeling approaches to food loss and waste. And on the call today, we also have Dr. Constance Gewa, who is our scientific program director, and Sam Bader, our communications officer, as well as myself. I'm Tatiana Castro, scientific program associate. So to get started, we're going to go through our agenda for today. So we have a few more welcome notes, and we'll go through a little bit about FFAR. Then Constance will introduce our presenter for today. We'll go through that presentation, and then we'll wrap up at the end with the Q&A session, and I'll come back for any closing remarks. So, like I said, at the end, we're going to have time for a Q&A session. So just as a reminder, at the bottom of your screen, there is a button that says Q&A, and this is where you can enter any questions that you have. Please feel free to add to this at any point in the presentation, and we'll wait for all of those questions to come in and address them at the end of the presentation. Okay. And then one more thing before we get started, we would like to launch a poll just to get your insights on the topic and what you know or may not know about FFAR and our food waste initiatives. So this research is really going to help us understand this information, how you all as stakeholders play a role. So we will take about 2 to 3 minutes for just a few short questions. A pop-up will come onto your screen momentarily, and you can type and click directly into that window. So give me just a moment to pull that up. Okay, so you should see the pop-up on your screen. I'll give you all a few minutes to answer the 4 questions. All right, I'll give you all another 30 seconds or so to finish putting in your responses. Okay, we're going to move on. Let me close out this poll. Okay. Thank you all for putting in your responses. So as a reminder, or rather, I'll let you all know that before the Q&A we do at the end of the presentation, we are going to pull up another survey just to get your feedback on what you learned, and it'll be the same process as we just did right now. But to move forward with our presentation, I'm going to pass it over to Constance, who's going to tell us a little bit more about FFAR and introduce our presenter. So Constance, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Tatiana. So just a brief introduction to FFAR, and then introduce our speaker today. So the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, also known as FFAR, was established in 2014 by the Farm Bill. We connect funders, researchers, and farmers to pioneer the next frontier of agriculture innovation. Next slide, please. It is our mission to build collaborative partnerships that support scientific research to address today's biggest food and agriculture challenges. And we do this, next slide, please. We do this using multiple funding mechanisms, the competitive grants, direct awards, prizes, and consortia. Next slide. So FFAR has 2 annual competitive research funding opportunities. These are separate from our special program calls that occur throughout the year. The first one of these annual opportunities is the Seeding Solutions. The Seeding Solutions supports bold research in any of our priority areas. Grantees must provide matching funds from non-federal partners for this. And also, Seeding Solutions have been used actually to support some of the research that we'll be hearing about today on food loss and waste. Next slide, please. Our second annual program is known as the New Innovator Award. The New Innovator Award targets early career scientists. We grant New Innovator Awards to faculty members in a tenure track position no longer than 3 years and who are within 8 years of receiving their PhD. Eligible candidates must also conduct research that aligns with our priority areas, and matching funds are optional for this opportunity. And just like Seeding Solutions, the New Innovator Award has been used to support some of the research on food loss and waste. Next slide, please. So why food loss and waste, you may ask? About 30% of the foods produced are wasted each year, and we're talking about within the US and outside of the US. Food loss occurs along the value chain, including production, distribution, and retail during food preparation and at consumption. And this contributes to economic losses and food and nutrition insecurity and climate change. So we know that reducing food loss and waste has the potential to improve economic status of various stakeholders, food availability and access, environmental conditions, and human health. And because of this, FFAR has invested nearly $15 million in research aimed at identifying innovative and effective ways to prevent and reduce food loss and waste along the value chain. Next slide, please. This month, together with our grantees, we have organized a series of webinars to highlight results and innovations from some of this research. Today's webinar is the third in the series and will be followed by another one scheduled for April 30th. Please visit the FFAR website for additional information on each of the planned webinars. Next slide, please. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's webinar presenter, Dr. Martin Weidmann. Dr. Weidmann is the Gillard Family Professor of Food Safety in the Department of Food Science at Cornell University. He also serves as the co-director of the New York State Integrated Food Safety Center of Excellence. The overall goal of his academic program is to develop and communicate the scientific knowledge needed to prevent and control foodborne and zoonotic diseases caused by bacteria, as well as microbial food spoilage. Dr. Weidmann's research and extension programs focus on a comprehensive and interdisciplinary farm-to-table approach to food safety and quality. His extension efforts cut across commodities and include training, as well as applied field research with dairy, seafood, meat, and produce growers, processors, and retail establishments. Dr. Weidmann received a Seeding Solutions grant in 2019 to develop a system where mathematical modeling can predict microbial food spoilage and support decision-making. Please welcome Dr. Weidmann.
Okay, thank you very much, Constance, and thank you very much, FFAR, for sponsoring this webinar and supporting our research. So I'm going to today talk about modeling approaches to reducing food loss as well as food waste. So as an outline, I'm first going to provide an overview of food spoilage, food loss, food waste, and then I'm going to go specifically into some of the digital approaches that we have developed and applied to reduce food waste and loss, and then come back with sort of the bigger picture. How do we develop an infrastructure to reduce food waste and loss across different commodities, across the US and across the world? Food loss and waste are sometimes two terms that are sometimes used interchangeably, but if you look at FAO and the technical definition, food loss happens at the producer and the processor level. So example of food loss would be product that is grown, a crop that is grown but is not harvested, or a crop that is processed but becomes waste at the processing level, while food waste is what occurs at the level of retail and consumer. So this might be food we don't consume and throw in the garbage. This might be food that stays on a retail shelf until past its shelf life and has to be tossed or wasted because it is not purchased in time. But importantly, as I said, these concepts are often used, these words are often used interchangeably, and our research really targets the whole value chain, so all of these components. Food waste, and then Constance already sort of mentioned that the estimate is that globally about 1/3 or about 30% of food is either lost or wasted. And so that covers both food loss and waste. This global food loss and waste has tremendous negative environmental impacts, for example, on carbon emissions, as shown in the second bullet, and also has tremendous negative consequence with regard for economies. And the US alone, food waste is estimated to represent loss of about $160 billion per year. If you look at the distribution of what commodities or what food groups are responsible for food loss, you can see on the bottom there are two big ones, dairy products and vegetables, both about 20%. Fruits and grain products, each about 14%, and fish and poultry about 12%. And then the other products really have a lower proportion of the total loss. And this is in billions of pounds, so not in economic value, but in pounds. Dairy products, along with vegetables, represent a major part of food waste. And so the project I'm representing to you today focused on dairy products because of this. However, we also have other similar and parallel projects that apply conceptually very similar approaches to reducing and controlling waste of produce and vegetables. If we look now specifically at dairy products, there's obviously a number of different dairy products, think cheese, yogurt, but fluid milk is the one that is responsible for a large proportion of the food waste in that dairy category. About 65% of food waste in volume falls into that category, which is one of the reasons why we can focused on fluid milk, but we have done other research in other dairy products, specifically yogurt, but also cheese. And the value of that fluid milk waste is about $6 billion. And so for those of you not in the dairy space, fluid milk is essentially any sort of liquid milk you drink. Typically, it might be known as fresh milk or HTST milk. This does not include raw milk, a product which consumption we don't encourage or discourage because it is linked to disproportionate foodborne illness. Another way of looking at that is the loss within each category. And you can see here, dairy products, 31% of products produced are lost, fruit, about 30%, vegetable, about 30%. So the numbers always come back to this about 30% value. Now, one important concept that I want to introduce right now is the idea of best by dates. And these are the dates that are printed on products, different products. And in order to convey information to consumer by which date the product will taste best. There's a lot of confusion about these dates. Some people think these are dates by which the product is safe. These are not safety dates with very, very few exceptions. One of them might be the deli meats that you buy in a retail store that have a date label on it, say consumers in 5 days. But the vast majority of these dates are solely there for product quality purposes. And they don't mean that the milk will turn bad after that date. It just means the risk, the likelihood of product not tasting its best increases substantially after that date. So for example, in this case, September 17, 2020. However, related to the issue of food waste, a lot of consumers will take product like this and throw it out. Let's say, again, in this example, if the date is September 17, 20, if it's September 18th, it's like, okay, I can't drink this anymore. It's probably bad. And this contributes substantially to food waste. Another contributor to food waste is that some people may not even buy product if it is too close or perceived as being too close to this shelf life date. So for example, if I'm in a store on September 14 and I have product that is labeled as September 17, I might say 3 days is too short. Or in this specific example, if I have multiple products in a store, some of them, as shown on the right, having a date of September 5 and the other one having a date of September 17, and the price is the same, I will typically choose the product that has a longer remaining shelf life, so the one with the date of 9/17, which then leaves the retailer with product that is beyond this best by date and therefore contributes to food waste. So these dates, take-home message, these dates are an important contributor to food waste. And with the digital approaches and the modeling approaches we develop as part of this, we also want to address this issue, as I will show you later. So let's talk about systems approaches and modeling approaches to reduce food waste and food loss. And this is the core of our project. The idea here, big picture, is to apply a concept that we call precision food systems to reducing food waste and food loss. Now, this is not a novel idea. We've heard about precision agriculture. This is where we use more data. Sometimes people call it big data, to be more precise in terms of where we apply fertilizer, where we plant, when we plant, to maximize yield. We've heard about personalized medicine, where we have enough data about each individual to be able to not just recommend one treatment to everyone, but taking into account individuals' person's genetics to treat people and prevent diseases. These same approaches of same ideas of more individualized approaches, for example, to look at milk differently in different seasons when the temperature might be different. We could see as precision food systems that can be utilized and leveraged to reduce food loss and food waste. And this will include the use of digital tools to model and predict shelf life, and as I will show you, to drive consumption of foods before end of shelf life and before they become food waste. This links to some larger initiatives, and one of them known as Industry 4.0, which is the digitalization of the industry in general, but also applied to food industry. While the food industry typically lags behind other industries in digitalization, they are working in this space, they're catching up in this space, and the tools we develop will ultimately work with this infrastructure of Industry 4.0 to take data in real time throughout the supply chain to allow companies and customers to make individual decisions on product consumption and shelf life and strategies for improving shelf life and reducing food waste. So our goal is really to develop tools that can be leveraged along with this idea of Industry 4.0. Another concept that now is taken more from medicine is the idea of a digital twin. A digital twin often is described as a customized computational model of a system. And in medicine, that system might be a patient. So you can literally have a computer program that stimulates your body and can simulate what happens if you consume a certain drug to treat a disease, how quickly the drug is degraded, how quickly it reaches the sites it reaches, and customize those drugs to achieve the best outcomes for your health. Our idea is to apply the same types of tools, but develop digital twins of food processing facilities and ultimately a whole food value chain from a farm, as shown in the bottom right, to the consumer to understand and model in real time what is happening along that supply chain and use that to provide anyone along this supply chain with the tools needed to reduce food loss and food waste. Okay, we're now going to move from the sort of the big picture theory to the practical nuts and bolts, what we've done to take these concepts and try to make them alive a little bit. This project was facilitated by the fact that our group at Cornell has a long history of creating data and collecting data on shelf life, quality, and food loss and food waste of fluid milk in the state of New York. Here's an example of two 10-year studies. So you can see with the two 10-year studies, that means we have at least 20, but more like 30 to 40 years of data of the quality of fluid milk produced in the state of New York from all processing plants. So we have a comprehensive data set that facilitated this development that I'm describing here. When we think about fluid milk, similar to many other products, there are different ways of how they can spoil. They can spoil by chemical reactions, which we're gonna ignore, not that they're not important, but for fluid milk, they have limited importance, as well as bacterial organisms. There are two types of organisms that spoil milk. One of them are gram-positive organisms, and these are organisms that could survive the process of heat treatment. So they could be introduced on the farm from the cow into the milk to survive the processing of milk and can spoil your milk. The second contributor to food spoilage can be gram-negative bacteria that are introduced inadvertently in the food processing facility. For example, in the process of filling a jug of milk or elsewhere in the system. These things happen rarely, but they do happen. And if they occur and milk is held for a prolonged time until the end of that shelf life label, they can cause spoilage. So when someone drinks it, the milk just doesn't taste right or might even coagulate and lead to a negative consumer reaction. So these are sort of what I'm going to call the enemies, the organisms, the processes that we try to model to better understand and predict food spoilage and food waste. What we have done, and I'm not going to go into the details, but if you're interested, you can read it. We've developed a series of different models to predict spoilage. You can see at the top left, we predict spoilage due to spore formers, one type of organisms that can cause spoilage. We predict spoilage due to gram-negative bacteria on the middle right, another type of organisms. And then we've improved these tools to really be able to predict real-world food spoilage. Now, how does this work, or what does this look like? So for example, once we have this model, we can now predict what happens in different days of shelf life. So what you see here in these graphs is on the x-axis, you see the number of bacteria in log scale. So 2 means 10 to the 2, so 100 bacteria. 6 means 10 to the 6, so 1,000,000 bacteria. And then on the y-axis, we show what proportion of containers fall into that category. And what you can see here, where we modeled bacterial numbers at day 21 and day 24, that as the milk has a longer shelf life, so as we look at day 24 versus day 21, more product has higher bacterial levels. Or another way to describe this is that a lower proportion of all containers that might be produced on a given day have low bacterial levels. So day 24, 5% of these milk jugs have less than 20,000 bacteria. but at day 21, that's 25% that have very low bacterial counts. Now, once we have these, we can now also build illustrations that make it easier for people to understand. So what we have here is a histogram that goes over time. So it starts at day 14 of shelf life, shows the bacterial numbers, and it shows the longer we go in shelf life, the more bacteria and the more containers of milk are there that have higher levels of bacteria. Now, that's interesting from a scientific perspective, but not yet super valuable for practical applications. However, after we validated these models, so we say, this is what we predict now. Does that fit what happens in the real world in New York? We could validate the model. It predicts what we see in the real world. We can then use those data to come up with different scenarios. One simple scenario might be to say, what happens if we keep milk at a lower temperature? So here we might have a scenario on top. What if the milk is stored at 6 degrees centigrade, which is about 45 degrees Fahrenheit? Or what if we store the milk at a lower temperature, 40 degrees Fahrenheit? And we can see that at 40 degrees centigrade, 90%, so the vast majority of half gallons, have very low levels at day 21. But at 6 degrees, there's a higher proportion, which makes sense. The warmer the temperature, the more milk spoils. Now, what is also illustrated is that if we can collect data real time in a not too near future, collect data real time on the temperature milk is stored or distributed at, we can more precisely predict spoilage than saying, well, we don't know what temperature milk is stored in a consumer refrigerator. We don't know what the truck has for a storage temperature when the milk is shipped. We don't know what temperature the milk is stored at retail. If we can start to get data feeds on real temperatures, we can more accurately predict shelf life, and rather than putting a date on there that tends to be a very conservative date, assuming that milk is exposed to higher temperatures. So we have the tools to more proactively and better predict shelf life. What we can also do with this tool that is now very important for processors is if a processor comes to us saying, well, we have this expensive piece of equipment that is called microfiltration, where we can filter out some bacteria. What will it do to the shelf life? We can model that, and you can see in red what happens when the milk is microfiltered versus in gray what happens if it is not. And we can say, on average, you will extend your shelf life by 4 days. That will help people make a decision on what technologies to invest in with regards to shelf life extension, rather than having doing very, very expensive real world experiments where you may have to spend $1 million on equipment. So these tools allow companies to make rational decisions on tools that can be used to extend shelf life and hence reduce food loss and food waste specifically. So these models, to dig a little bit deeper, can be asked to answer very specific questions related to spoilage. Which intervention is most effective in reducing certain types of spoilage at a processing plant? We can have a baseline scenario that represents what a plant is doing right now. We can have values for how many bacteria are typically found on day 7, day 10, what percent of containers have a certain number of bacteria. So in this case, at day 7, 34% of containers have high number of bacterial levels. We can then use this one to predict what happens if we do certain things. We talked about microfiltration first. We can also model things. What happens if you spend more time in cleaning your equipment? What happens if you buy improved equipment that reduces your frequency of contamination of milk? You can compare these values to the baseline, and you can see here you have lower numbers of bacteria on day 7 and 10. But most importantly, we can see that your shelf life goes from day 7 to day 13. You have the same percent of milk cartons that are above a certain level of bacteria. However, it now takes 13 days to reach that level rather than 7 days. So in this case, we have a 6-day shelf life extension. Now you combine it with the previous slide, we can say, okay, microfiltration gives me 4 days. This gives me 6 days. What is the cost? And I can come up with the most cost-efficient strategies to increase shelf life and also model what combinations of different strategies will do. So very important for industry to make these practical decisions. Now, this is the first part. This is what I would call the more technical part. Now, economics plays a big role, right? I can tell with the tools we've developed how much extended shelf life do you get. I can maybe even estimate how much it costs you to make these changes. But what's the return on investment? What is the value of milk having another day of shelf life, 2 or 3 days of shelf life, which means less waste, but who will pay for this? So we had, as part of our FFAR-funded project, Erna Dolger, an economist at Cornell, on our team, and we've addressed some of these questions as a little detail in the next few slides. So, simple first example is this: we've used in this research we looked at how do we assess the cost of implementing different interventions, and you can see this here. We use this through expert elicitation. We can provide people in a cost of increased cleaning and sanitation, and therefore help people again make decisions of what interventions to implement. However, the key is, how do we assess what are the benefits of implementing these interventions? Okay, I can invest a certain amount of dollars, but how much do I get out? In order to do this, there were 2 studies we conducted as part of this project. One of them is what's called a willingness to pay study, and they estimated that a consumer would be willing to pay about 8 cents per added day of shelf life. So what this means, if I give you 2 milks, one of them has a date label on 10 days from now, and the other one has 11 days from now, I'm willing to pay 8 cents more. This is somewhat less than a previous study that estimated this value at 24 cents, but it's right in there. We also used the different methods, a price premium regression analysis, where we looked at what does milk with different shelf life sell at retail, where we estimate the value at 3 cents. So this is a wide range, right? We go from 3 cents to 24 cents per added shelf life, but this value will be different to different consumers. And there will be a difference of an added day of shelf life if it's 5 versus 6 versus 55 versus 56, etc. But it gives us an overall estimate that we can start to do to estimate return on investment and come up with some of these better strategies of reducing food waste. So now what we can do is we can do some arithmetics. We before estimated the cost of more cleaning, so increased what we call increased periodic equipment cleaning. It provides 6 to 7 days of shelf life. We can estimate the benefit to the company. We can estimate the social benefit, and we do this by using carbon emission as calculating social benefits and the common costs applied to that. These might obviously change. We can lose the cost of intervention, and then we can do the benefit minus cost, so to essentially calculate a return on investment. Now, these are obviously somewhat simplistic calculations because every company will have to do them different. These values will change, etc. But it provides a framework that will allow companies and others to assess the benefits of extending shelf life of fluid milk and then apply it to other commodities too. Now, one of the really cool final parts of this study was to now use these modeling approaches where we can predict shelf life to try to drive sales of product with short shelf life. And the ultimate goal and idea here is to develop a dynamic pricing system. Now, that might sound fancy, but it really isn't that fancy. It's been something that's been around forever. And the idea is simply to change the price depending on the shelf life of the product. The shorter the shelf life, the cheaper the product. And obviously, it's been around for decades, if not centuries. You can see discounted product because it's at the end of the shelf life. But what we would do here is to take that digitally by providing people with a QR code that they can use to scan. It can be scanned and then predict shelf life as well as predict and provide a price. So this is what this would look like. These were the milk containers that we actually sold at initially the Cornell store where we sell milk that we make at Cornell. So no more shelf life date, but a QR code. We provided customers with 2 choices. They could have milk with a QR code that they had to scan, or they had the regular milk with a shelf life printed on. So on the right side, you see 3 different fat levels with a QR code that would use models to give you a predicted shelf life, and then 3 containers with a static shelf life. That was just the classical date printed on it. The initial thing we looked at was what do people do with regard to sales? And what we have here is the sales for milk with a QR code in black and static in gray. And what you can see is, in most times, the QR code actually slightly outsold the milk with a static code. What this shows us, something we sort of expected, is that some people simply don't like the hassle of scanning a QR code, but some people will, and they'll use that to either get pricing or shelf life information. So provided us with an idea that, yes, this could be done, and we could use that concept of dynamically providing shelf life in the real world. What we did in the next study is we actually then partnered with a commercial company, a retailer, and we did 2 phases. Phase 1 was we simplified and actually moved away for the specific study from the QR code because, not all people accepted it. It was by about 50%, but rather used a color code. So the color code in the first week, phase 1 was, or the first few weeks, phase 1 was, purple was 0 to 3 days remaining shelf life, green 4 to 7, blue 8 to 21. And all the milk cost the same, but it provided information, say, hey, if you buy milk with a sell-by date that best fits your needs, let's say conceptually, you have a large family that drinks a lot of milk, it's okay. You buy 0 to 3 days because you have to buy milk again in 2 days. Do that because it helps the earth, okay? Yeah, some people might go for this. Our expectation was not. Phase 2, however, we provided people with different prices. The milk that had a short remaining shelf life would cost you $1.39, but the milk that had a longer shelf life, 8 to 21 days, would cost you $3.39, so $2 more. A substantial difference in cost, right? And the idea was that we could use this price incentive, this initial dynamic pricing, to drive sales of products with shorter shelf life so that it would not stay in the retail shelf and would not have to be discarded and therefore would not contribute to food waste. So here we have the results for the week 1, where there was no economic incentive, and you can see, not surprisingly, most people would buy milk that had a high remaining shelf life, so there's up to 21 days. Very few people bought milk that had 0 to 3 days, and some of them bought milk with the medium day. However, as soon as we provide an economic incentive, the amount of consumers that bought milk with a medium and even a short shelf life went up substantially. So we were able to successfully drive sales of milk that otherwise would have ended up being wasted. Interestingly enough, we even were able to increase the overall profit margin for the retailer because the milk with a longer shelf life now was actually priced at a higher value than the overall average value that was used, or average cost that was used before. So this shows how you can develop models and illustrates how you can develop models that cover everything from helping processing plants and make decisions on strategies for extending shelf life and reducing waste in a much more rational way than they have previously done, through models that can ultimately be developed into full digital twins, to integrating these models into retail decisions and into retail sales by driving sales of product before it is wasted. Ultimately, these tools could even reach through into consumer homes, and we've had discussions, for example, to use these smart labels along with a smart refrigerator, which actually do exist, to scan your product in your refrigerator and warn you when you have product with a short remaining shelf life, and encourage you to use that, for example, in recipes. Now, importantly, while the work I described to you today is focused on fluid milk, you can see here a number of papers that we described on working in other categories such as yogurt, and also a paper that is even more of an optimization paper where we're literally looking at optimizing pasteurized fluid milk shelf life through using some of these data in optimization type studies. So Looking at the big picture, I think I hopefully have convinced you by now that data collection, data use in models to predict shelf life is a much better strategy than a static shelf life that is often very conservative and can have significant contributions to food waste. But how do we get there? How do we take these tools and allow industry to use them seamlessly to reduce food loss and food waste? We need to have the digital infrastructure to allow for this. The idea of this was outlined in a paper in Science in 2018 that sort of illustrates the integration of farmers with processors and retailers and consumers in terms of monitoring impacts, communicating these impacts, monitoring throughout the supply chain, incentivize sustainable consumption, which is exactly what our smart labels, I'm going to call them, would do, and integrating all of that into a single platform that feeds real-time data into shelf life prediction. Ultimately, this will require us, or hopefully require us, to improve the strategy for sensors throughout the supply chain, include a mapping of farms, consumers, distribution routes, because what I showed you here so far is not the only thing that drives CO2 consumption. So for example, routes of travel, how often does milk need to be delivered to a retail, will substantially contribute to carbon emissions associated with food production. If we can include that and optimize shelf life, for example, to assure that retail stores that require long transportation routes are served with milk that has an extended shelf life, so we don't need to truck milk there once a day or every 2 days, but maybe only every 7 days, could also further reduce carbon emissions associated with the overall food systems. However, all of that requires a digital infrastructure. And I'm not just talking about a discussion that's often been heard is about we need broadband for rural areas. That is what I would call the foundational digital infrastructure for this, for improved, and maybe we call it a food industry 4.0 system. We need other tools. We need user-friendly interfaces, availability of those tools, which is something that we started through a web page that we call Digital Dairy. But again, that's a small step towards it. The bigger picture is to also make more data available once we have enough digital bandwidth to have temperature sensors, weather data, etc., throughout the supply chain that we can use them to feed very quickly to predict shelf life dynamically, ultimately affecting price. For example, as I showed today, if you look at this for produce, to have sensors, have satellite or even data, more real-time satellite data, or have drone-based data that show us the conditions in the field because they can impact the shelf life of lettuce, to do better predictions there. Have all of that available for food in the food system to allow us to design a more efficient food system. To me, this is the infrastructure that food needs in the 21st century. So hopefully, coming to the end here, I've shown you that a systems approach to reducing food loss and waste is essential, but still often missing. We take complex raw commodity, take it through processing, distribute it, put it in a consumer refrigerator, and we stamp one date on it and make you pay one price for it. That's not enough. We need to have better tools. We need to take into account the complexity of the system to predict shelf life and predict the effectiveness of different ways to reduce food loss and waste. We often hear about upcycling, but that's at the end. What I really want you all to take home from this is prevention. Systems for preventing food waste from the very beginning are very, very important. I hope I've given you some idea on new tools and approaches that can increase the sales of product before end of shelf life, therefore reducing food waste, but also hopefully giving you an idea that some of the foundational tools, the models, etc., are becoming available. However, practical implementation will require an infrastructure and maybe requires us to think about a digital food infrastructure initiative for the US and beyond to move our food system to the next century and to help it become more sustainable. With that, I want to again thank FFAR for contributing funding to this, the New York State Dairy Promotion Order, which essentially distribute dairy farmers dollars, dairy farmer checkoff, and Chobani for contributing to this project. Thank you very much, and with this, I'm ready to answer any questions that may have come up.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Weidmann. Before we get into the questions, I just want to give us about a couple of minutes to complete the feedback poll. We just have a few short questions we want to get your insight on, and then I'll pass it over to Constance for the Q&A. So same like before, please type and put in your answers directly into the poll on your screen, and then we will finish with the Q&A session. All right, we'll take another 30 seconds to finish getting some responses before we move on. Okay, thank you all for completing the survey, and I'll pass it back to Constance to go through a few questions before we wrap up.
Thank you, Tatiana, and thank you so much, Dr. Weidmann. And I know your questions, and Tatiana will share some of those questions from the poll as well. I am really intrigued, Dr. Weidmann, by the results that you found in your study regarding the consumer behavior, where when there's an economic incentive. I can't help but wonder, because when there's economic incentive and there's no food waste at the retail, I'm wondering, is that behavior, is there change within the household? Are people buying more milk because they need it, or are they buying more milk and keeping more milk at home because it is cheaper? And so we basically shifted the waste of food to a different level. Do we have research that has looked at that?
That is a very, very good question. It's a question we definitely discussed. It's like, what does it, and you put it very well. It's like, does it just shift the food waste? Now the waste doesn't occur at retail, but it occurs elsewhere. So there are a couple of ways of to assess that. The overall sales did not change. So we don't have direct evidence for this, but the assumption is if the overall sale doesn't change, then it doesn't mean people are hoarding milk and throwing it away at home, but it's simply picking the milk that is better suited for their consumption history. However, more research in that space is definitely needed. But I think logically speaking, we know that there are different types of consumers. There are consumers that, where milk is where half a gallon of milk is consumed over a week, while other consumers consume a lot of milk over a very short amount of time. But there's definitely more work needed in that space in terms of shifting waste. However, and this is where the dynamic shelf life labeling comes in, is typically the milk that we take home, even if it shows today is the day of the label, that milk tends to be good for at least another 6 to 7 days. Okay. Now, if we use the dynamic shelf life labeling, the consumers can get that information and get it updated, right? That's the future. You put it in a refrigerator that said it's 40 degrees, your shelf life label will show you this milk is still good, even though at retail, we need to assume people put it on a slight temperature abuse, maybe 45 degrees. If you put in your refrigerator and your fridge is 40 degrees, that shelf life immediately gains some additional days. That ultimately this model can predict real time. So the prediction, the dynamic shelf life prediction, shouldn't stop at retail, but could continue in the consumer home. So that's the ultimate long-term big picture, right? But what you need for that is an integration of refrigerator temperature data with the smart sensor, and that's where this digital infrastructure comes in.
Okay, thank you. So there's still more work to be done there. And
I think definitely on the consumer side. So thank you for mentioning that. That is really an important area.
Yeah, I know you did mention the importance of having these models, decision models available for use, but do you see a situation where these models can be developed for other products, the same models like the ones or could we use, I'm wondering whether, if there are more models developed, then we have too many models that can be overwhelming, but also maybe trying to incorporate and integrate different products and food waste across different products. What would be easiest?
Right. I think very good question, right? So I think there's they're going to be, if we talk about different models, we got to take this. The baseline model will be very similar. It doesn't matter in the other area, whether that model is spinach or milk, right? What will be different is the type of microbes, where they come from, and how quickly they grow. So I will have a very similar, if not essentially the same model, but I will have to have different input data and data running behind the screen. I might have for spinach versus milk, right? Now that doesn't have to be visible to the end user, right? I can easily design an interface where someone says, okay, what's my product? Milk, spinach, broccoli, yogurt, you name it. And what's my temperature profile? Or here the data I want you to use for a temperature profile, and then I want you to predict the shelf life, okay? Now, what we find is it does get challenging, more challenging with products such as spinach or fresh produce, because the produce might have very different microbes that grow differently depending on when it is harvested and where it is harvested. So again, that's where the idea of digital infrastructure comes in. If I know where it came from, what the conditions were in the field. So again, take the spinach example. If I harvest the spinach 2 days after rain, that spinach is going to spoil faster than if I harvested it 5 days after rain, for example, as a simplified example. But if you have those data, our predictions become more accurate. But a lot of these factors can be behind the scene, that we have a single integrated model. It looks very seamlessly, but behind the scenes, it runs with different input data.
Thank you. I know at FFAR, one of the reason why at FFAR we fund the research and the work that we do is really thinking about impactful research and really bring together multiple stakeholders to be part of this. These decision tools, they would only make sense and be of impact if they're being utilized. I'm curious, how has the industry received such innovation? Have they been part of this? Did you see the adoption rate or level? Is there that interest and willingness to invest in such innovation in the industry?
There is the biggest impact we have seen, or uptake we have seen at this point, but that's also where we have had the models for the longest time, is rational decision making in a processing plant. So we've definitely had plants come to us saying, hey, we our customers say they want milk with longer shelf life. We need to increase the shelf life by 3 days. How do we do this? Should we buy this equipment or that equipment or this equipment? I mean, well, let's take a look at the data. Let's model it out, and we can tell them, saying, you know, equipment A and B are not going to get you there, but C will get you there. And so it helps them make decisions much more quickly in terms of, and much more economically efficient in terms of where to invest for enhanced shelf life. Similarly with yogurt, people might say, well, I want to make my yogurt without preservatives, without additional sorbates, but then it spoils fast. The first question is, how much faster does it spoil? And then what alternatives can I use to bring the shelf life back? How much does it cost me? So that's where we've seen a lot of uptick. The work on the sort of the retail side, the dynamic pricing, is relatively new. Mm-hmm. So we haven't had as much time to sort of communicate that. But the retailer we work with saw a profit increase because they could charge more for the milk with longer shelf life and had less waste. So I expect there to be some interest in that too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's interesting you mentioned that there's more work to be done at the retail level and the consumer. Consumers are still, when it comes to behavior change, you know, it's difficult. And yes, convincing consumers to this, you know, something that is has fewer days. And I know economics makes sense, it's an economic incentive, but just changing that behavior is not that easy. Thinking about food safety, a lot of us look at, as you mentioned, the best if used by date, the use by date as an issue of food safety. How is this going to change, change consumer perception about shelf life and use by dates and the issue and belief around food safety as well? Because all that has to be considered in as you're thinking about these decision models and influencing behavior change. Did you look into that and ask questions about consumer perception about food safety? How did they receive this?
We have not dug too deep into that one yet, because you absolutely agree with you, and it's actually almost like a double whammy, right? If it's cheaper and it has less shelf life, if it's cheaper, it's going to be less safe, right? The perception, again, is not true. Yeah. And it has shorter shelf life, and so will people. So when they voted with their feet or with their pocket, they bought the product. So the idea is that at least for a part of the consumers, that's not an issue. Mm-hmm. The smart labels, the QR codes provide an opportunity, right, for conveying more information. That whole issue of use by, best by dates, I mean, it's been identified right and left as one of the major drivers of food waste and loss, right? So there is a huge need about communication. There's a much larger initiatives in place to replace them, and right, you know, at least standardizing the date, not saying use by, but best if used by, because use by implies if you don't use it by, you're gonna be like really screwed. And so I think that some of these, we need to watch some of these larger initiatives, and then there needs to be more communication about these in the long term. Absolutely. But it's something we've always worried about, is that sort of perception issue about it's cheap and has a shorter shelf life. Is it good for me? Is it good for my family? And that needs to be addressed.
Thank you. And that's all the questions that we had time for. I will now turn it back to Tatiana. Thank you so much, Dr. Weidmann.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Constance. And thank you, Dr. Weidmann, for your presentation today. I just wanted to let you all know to please visit the FFAR website. After this webinar, you can find more information about the work that we're doing in this space. As you can see, Constance's information is on the screen here. So in case you have any other questions, you can reach out to her. And a recording of this webinar will also be posted on our page, so you can watch that afterward or share with your networks. So thank you all for joining, and I hope you have a great day.